There's a fact of spiritual life that I've pondered for a very long time, increasingly so lately because of a project I'm working on, which is to understand how an avatar or a very advanced saintly person actually does or does not participate in this world. It's a very, really a very confusing and a very subtle question. It matters to me because I'm making an effort to write about a lot of experiences that I had with Swami Kriyananda. And in the many years that I was closely associated with him, it was always necessary to understand what the appropriate response to him would be. And part of that was based on a proper understanding of what he himself was experiencing. I mean, the benefit of being in the company, of having satsang, even with our peers on the spiritual path, or with someone who we have reason to believe has a greater understanding, is because it requires that you meet that vibration. And from the very beginning, what I found I think the actual word I would have to use is exhilarating about being in Swami Kriyananda's company was the requirement of absolute alertness on my part. Sometimes it was a joke in that he would correct my grammar or edit my sentences if I hadn't said exactly what I meant. It became, his watchword was, "The editor never sleeps." So however trivial the issue was, he would always fix it. I could never get I and me correctly. For some reason, I must have been sick during those days when I learned them in school, and I would always mess them up. Swami was on a radio show and in Los Angeles, a big radio show, and the host thought it would be interesting to have someone else on who knew him well, and that was me. And she'd ask me some question. I was in the middle of the story. I used I and me incorrectly. On live radio, Swami interrupts, corrects my grammar, which caused the two of us just to burst out laughing. The poor host was utterly bewildered. She didn't really have any idea what was going on, so we just recovered and went forward. And it was a very small issue. I mean, grammar is nice, especially if you write and speak. That it's nice to be able to speak properly, but God will accept you whether your grammar's any good or not. That's not really the point. But it was symbolic of the fact that every moment counts. Where is our consciousness? What are we doing? What are we actually thinking? How are we responding? And he never let it go by. But I always had trouble understanding, and I still do, which is why my words sort of failed me here. Like, on one hand, if a soul has this constant awareness of the divine, and therefore never forgets his oneness with God, never forgets that this world is bliss, how do you deal with all the stuff that happens? And oftentimes, especially over time, the life of an avatar, the life of a great saint, becomes very two-dimensional, because most of us don't know how to understand this. So we just sort of put the masters, and then it becomes mythical. Buddha, Krishna, Jesus. You don't ever get the reality of what it was to live and breathe and walk and be with such a person. Yogananda was more recently, and we have first-hand accounts, especially from Swami Kriyananda. Swami Kriyananda was even more recently. We have many first-hand accounts. But even as I lived with him, I could never quite understand it. So, saying all of that, because when I treated him as if his heart wasn't tender and he wasn't experiencing, then he always corrected me. But if I treated him as if everything was a catastrophe, like I might feel it, he also corrected me. So there was something else that we're all reaching for, and this is attunement. Because the other side of it, the way this manifests in our lives, I was teaching a class yesterday, and someone in the context of the class asked the obvious question: if we're here to grow and we find ourselves in challenging circumstances, how can we tell whether we're supposed to just stick it out and face the challenge And when can we ever say, this is too much for me? And in a real sense, this is the whole spiritual path, because we can't progress from any point except the point at which we're presently standing. And too much of religion, not spirituality, but religion, starts with a picture of what it's supposed to look like. This is what you're supposed to be like if you love Jesus, if you love Krishna, if you're doing Kriya Yoga. This is what it's supposed to look like. So we take ourselves from where we are and we try to squeeze in there. And we work hard. It's very well intentioned. There's nothing mistaken about it. Obviously, we can't take what it means to be a self-realized master and paste it on us and then call ourselves self-realized. I had a delightful conversation with a gentleman, delightful from my side, who had computed out that it seemed that many great souls came into a full awareness of their greatness around the age of 33. Lahiri Mahashaya met Babaji at that point. He had several other examples. And he was 31. And although I have to say he never actually articulated it, I could see that he felt all he had to do was stick it out for 2 more years. I asked him as gently as I could if he had a fallback plan. If 33 came and went. But we just get these ideas in our head about how it's supposed to be. I remember reading very early on the spiritual path that sometimes people attain enlightenment in their sleep. They go to sleep in delusion and they wake up enlightened. And I put in a vote for that one. No one was listening, as far as I know. But we just get these ideas in our head. But what happens is we get disconnected. Or we get disconnected from deep parts of ourselves because, one, suffering is no fun. And a lot of us carry, and I've sort of come to understand myself in a different way, so I'll use myself as an example. I was born in this lifetime with just this absolute intense determination to be happy, which in a way was sort of odd, because I was happy. I had a very pleasant childhood. I was a very cheerful kid. Things came pretty easy to me. Nothing traumatic ever happened to me. But my absolute first value was I had to understand where happiness came from, and I had to, get my hands on that key and use it. I was avid on the point. And when I finally came to Swamiji and came to Ananda, I said, this is so peculiar to me, sir, because this has been so intense with me, but really, effectively, I've never suffered. And he said the obvious, past lives. Things happen to us over many incarnations. We make decisions based on those experiences, and those become the decisions that we follow now, even if the origin point of those decisions is quite long ago. And over the course of the many years that I've been on the spiritual path, I would say an essential part of sadhana has been to overcome my fear of not what I'm experiencing now, but what I have experienced. Suffering holds us in a whole lot of different ways. Suffering is it. You have terrible pain in your body, you have terrible pain in your heart, you have a guilty conscience. Whatever it might be, there it is. You go through some 6 months of terrible chemotherapy or some botched operation. There's lots of ways. The body hurts. Then the mind hurts. The emotions hurt. All of these things happen to us. It's not pleasant. But it comes and goes. It's the nature of things. Yogananda, I believe, said, pleasure is the point between 2 pains, and pain is the point between 2 pleasures, because it always goes like this, constantly. Change is the only certainty. But after the suffering stops, then we have other ways of working with it. And one of the ways that tie us to suffering is if we think we were treated unfairly. And the reason we suffered is because somebody did something to me. And oftentimes somebody did do something to you, because other people are just as messed up as you are. Everybody's the same messed up. We're all working out our karma one way or another, else you wouldn't be here. So often people do something to you, and your suffering was caused by them. So now your suffering carries into here, because we have this big thing about who did what to whom, with the thought in our mind that our suffering, which is already over, could be lessened if they made it right. Somebody should apologize to me. That's how it always comes down in my heart. Somebody owes me an apology. For something they did 300 years ago. They owe me an apology. Or the other that ties it to us is if we're fearful. If we're afraid, we might end up back there again. And the second two are far more enduring than the suffering itself. Because the suffering itself, the event comes and goes, but once we wrap ourselves around these things, now it's also an incentive. The memory of that, whatever it was, made me very avid from a very young age to find something that would really work. In the monologue that I've memorized for our play, Meeting the Masters, of Sister Gyanamata, she says when she was 4 years old, her father died. It put the family in very difficult financial circumstances. I could recite the whole monologue. My mother confided in me completely, Sister Gyanamata says, even though she was only 4 years old. Her mother was wise enough to know what she had in her 4-year-old child. At a very young age, Sister Gyanamata said, I saw many tears and I learned early to deal with suffering. She says, I resolved to base my life on eternal truths. She's 4 years old. She says, my steady progress to the Master, I feel, began at that point. Because what do we do with the suffering? Do we fear it? Do we blame someone and wait for them to fix it? Or do we let it be a catalyst for where we're going to go next, what we're going to do? Now, let me find the point. I have a little point here. So the Gyanamata's response, I'm going to base my life on eternal realities, does not erase those memories, nor does it ensure that nothing bad will ever happen again. Because here's Sister Gyanamata, she obviously must have been a Jivan Mukta because Master said she was fully liberated. But also in that monologue is this line. She writes Master a letter of gratitude in 1941. And it's a list of all the things she's grateful for, because the note ends with, I offer you reverence, gratitude, devotion, and love. And one of the things she thanks him for is this. When her husband died, she had no place to go. The details of it I'm not certain of. But Master took her to Mount Washington and made her a nun. She was in her 60s. But she also says, for holding me to the path when, bewildered by an agony of pain, I knew not which turn to take. This is someone who's going to become liberated, and she describes herself as bewildered by an agony of pain. So it's not as simple as it doesn't happen, or I don't feel it, or I suppress it. Because I can feel the effect of everything that I'm still afraid of. And increasingly, my sadhana has been to not be afraid of it. And that doesn't mean one enjoys it, but here's now where I'm wanting to come to. And this is how Swami talked in his expanded commentary on our very reading today. This is what he says. The ego is the soul, let's use the word soul, identified with this physical body. This is the body for which I am responsible. And in the simplest terms, this is the body that we're all responsible. A little baby, babies go through these stages of psychological development where they gradually figure out that they're actually inside this body. I'm always been amused by the fact that apparently babies can be frightened by their own hands because their whole bodies are completely out of control. And they haven't really identified with this sort of wonky system that they're in, and their hands will suddenly flash in front of their face, and they don't have any idea where it came from or what it is. It'll startle them. You can imagine it. You have to just bend your mind a little and you can feel it like that. But gradually they do understand. But also little children feel themselves to be part of everything, but there comes a point of important psychological development for a child when it realizes that it's actually separate. And that can be quite traumatic. It has to be integrated in the right way because they suddenly realize that there are boundaries to their reality. And of course, compared to being part of all that is, it's scary. Of course, it's necessary because they're not really free, they're just ignorant, which is quite different. And ignorant is not bliss eventually. But eventually, we recognize that this is the body for which I am responsible. That's the ego connection. But that itself is not bondage. It's just a fact. Because Master incarnated into a physical body, and he was responsible for that body. Kriyananda incarnated in such a body. Gyanamata did. Jesus, Krishna. It was their body. Now, they relate to it very funnily. Like Master himself, toward the end of his life, when his mission was almost over, he's walking with Swami Kriyananda and he stumbles. And then he explains, he said, I'm in so many bodies, I forget which one I am responsible for. And then I believe he said, I have to ask people whether I've eaten or not, because he's become so detached from it. And Swami Kriyananda actually, interestingly, at the end of his life, became very much that way also. But before that, he was very engaged in what he called the event, which was Swami Kriyananda, because he was responsible for that body. But how Swami describes it, the ego, he says, is our reference point. When you're in a group of people, which body do I move? When there's food on the table, which mouth do I feed? When I have to relate to people, who among these people are the ones that I am responsible for? Who are the sheep in my flock? When a decision has to be made about Dharma, we have to have a reference point. As one of my friends said, it's not only what God wants, but who he wants it from. We have to have a reference point. Now, bringing it back to ourselves and not just Swamiji, we have to have a reference point. Something needs to be done. I may even have a great idea for doing it, but I have to have a reference point. Is this really mine to do? Is this really what God is asking me to do? Merely because I could tell someone something that would be helpful to them, I have to ask, is it really mine to do? And that's our reference point. But Swamiji says that reference point can either constantly turn back on itself, what about me? What about me? Or from that reference point can expand to become service to everyone, devotion to God. And there's still that sense of connectedness, but the reference has enlarged. And this is how Swamiji, and he said it to me many times, and I still just keep rolling it like this. His heart was not less tender, but far more, because he could feel the nuances. A lot of us, we become so interested in what we're doing that we don't really see the consequences to other people. I hope I've gotten better in my life. I was very, very bad at this when I was younger. Just if I wanted it, it wasn't, Swami understood me very well. It wasn't really that I was trying to injure someone else. I was unconscious of injuring someone else because I was so focused on where I was going, which could be worse. Ahimsa is the lack of desire, the desire to be harmless, to not cause harm. Ahimsa is getting rid of the desire. But still, unconsciousness, because the reference point is not wide enough. And so I'm unconscious of what's happening. Swamiji was never unconscious of what was happening, because his reference point was so broad that he knew the implications for all of us, and he literally felt them, I believe, inside himself. But still, He had a reference point, and decisions had to be made. But he felt it all extremely deeply. There was, in fact, much more because of that. Also, much more because he didn't have either of those two other elements. He didn't feel like anybody was doing something unfair to him, nor was he afraid. So when experiences came, they could sweep through him completely. And many, many extremely sad and difficult things happened to him. As you all know, his closest spiritual associates from early in his life repudiated him at a certain point and never ceased to vilify him to the end of his life. That's a big betrayal. And he just had to live with it constantly. And it was not less of an experience for him, but it was in the context. His point of reference had become God's will. Above all, his point of reference, I am a disciple. That's all. I am a disciple. That's my point of reference. There is an ego identified with a body that has to live, but my point of reference is not this ego identified with the body. My point of reference is, I am a disciple. And as a disciple, some pretty tough stuff goes through this ego. Pretty tough. But if my reference point is my ego, then the world becomes so small that it's entirely this. If my reference point is I am a disciple, then the same thing happens, but it looks so entirely different. Can we see that? And this is what we're striving for. And what this makes us, Swami made an interesting comment once. At a certain point in his life, something happened that was completely out of the flow. And it required a great deal of courage on his part, and also courage on the part of a few others. And the others were dragging their feet. Swami's comment was very simple. He said, I'm entirely accustomed to following my heart. By that he meant following the stream of love and the intuition that this is mine to do. I'm entirely accustomed to following my heart. And he spoke of the others. He said, they're not as used to doing it as I am. So it was harder for them to drag along. Swami just saw this was mine to do. His reference point was being a disciple, and it just took the flow of energy and went with it. We cannot ever, and it's a mistake in our spiritual path that many people make, to think either that suffering is a sign of spirituality, which we're not into so much anymore, but still that there is a way I ought to behave. There is no I ought to behave. But what we need to do is make our reference point God. Our reference point being a disciple. As a disciple, wow, look what's happening to me. But the degree to which we fear it is the degree to which we're just going to be bound to it forever. This is a very mixed bag of a world. And the bliss of this world is not that it works out. Because we ourselves have a lot of karmic debts to pay. I mean, all of us. I can remember a lot of them in this lifetime. And I have intuited a lot of them from other lifetimes. Nobody's doing anything to me that I didn't spend first. I paid it forward, and now it comes. Paid it backwards, and now it comes. I don't know how that actually works. Nobody's doing anything to any of us. It all has to be balanced at one point or another. And if our reference point is I am a disciple, Sister Gyanamata in that wonderful monologue says, I knew I needed a guru before she met Master, because I knew I couldn't really grow spiritually unless I had one. But until I found one, the right one, she said, I would take life itself as my guru. I would take every experience with the attitude of a disciple, and every circumstance as a direct lesson from my Master. And then she said, but I still wanted a guru, so eventually he came. But once you have a Master, what do you do? Well, being a disciple, whether you know who your Master is or not, be a disciple of life, which is to say, transform me. I hope it's better than this. I hope there's something in front of us. This isn't bad. It's been a good run. But this isn't perfect bliss. And until we get there, transform me. Because our hearts were made for Thee alone and will ever be restless until they find their rest in God. God bless you.